This is the video to properly set up your silverback. The silverback is an amazing tool for learning the best types of shots in archery. The surprise, unanticipated shot. Now the way this release works is it's set to actually activate or fire based on tension. So the basic principle to it is that there's a small spring inside of this release, and as you pull on the release, it compresses the spring until it gets to a desired weight where it will fire. So what you have to do is you have to set up this release to properly match not only the holding weight of your bow, meaning the weight that your bow is sitting at when it's at a full draw position, but also how much you're going to pull against that weight until you want your release to fire. Now say you have a 70-pound bow at an 80% let off. That means you're holding 20% of the weight that you're drawing. So at the full draw position, you're going to hold about 14 pounds. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to set this release so that as you build over the 14-pound range, it's going to fire at a certain point. Now that point is really going to depend on your level of knowledge and understanding of the tension on a cam system. Because sometimes if you're not really familiar with a compound bow, you can pull against the wall harder times than other times. And learning that principle is a big reason why the silverback is such a great training tool. So for beginners, I normally like to start them out with a little bit higher weight setting than a more advanced archer, simply because your understanding of how much pressure you have against the back wall of that cam can vary. So let's just take into consideration that you've got a 70-pound bow and an 80% let off, which is most common, and you're holding 14 pounds. I really like a beginner to start out by having the release set to where it activates from anywhere from 4 to 5 pounds over their holding weight. So if you're holding 14 pounds, we're going to want this release to fire at the beginning somewhere around that 19-pound range. Now most silverbacks come out of the package at approximately that position. However, there's a couple different ways to check it. The most precise way to check it is with a digital scale. So a digital bow scale, depending on the quality, can give you a variation of how accurate that number is. Some scales are slightly different in their actual setting. So for this scale, which I know is accurate, I'm going to go ahead and set this to 0, and I'm going to put my silverback on the scale, and I'm going to pull it until it fires, and that's going to give me a number. So this new silverback out of the package is firing at about 19.9 pounds. So that's actually about right if I'm holding 14 pounds. But what I'm going to do if I want to adjust that weight is I'm going to insert the Allen wrench that comes with your release into the back, and I'm going to reduce that amount of pulling weight needed by turning this screw counterclockwise. So as you loosen the screw, you will reduce the amount of pressure on the spring, thus reducing the amount of tension that you're going to need to make that spring compress to fire. So I'm going to turn this about 2 turns, which is going to be about equal to 1 pound. And I'm going to go ahead and close this release down, reset my scale, and load the release, pull until it fires. And that weight is going to tell you exactly what your pulling position is. So once you know that, then you're going to test this on your bow. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to make sure that you always hold the safety down or fully compress the safety lever all the way anytime you pull the bow back or let the bow forward. Because remember, as you pull the bow, your weight goes from 0 all the way up to your peak weight and then back down to your holding weight. So if you have this release set to fire at 19 pounds, then there's a very good chance as soon as you get a few inches in your draw without the safety on, you're going to already be achieving that weight and you're going to cause it to fire. So what you want to do is you want to learn to close the clasp, hold your finger on the safety, come to your full draw position, pull the bow till it stops, kind of get a feel for being on the wall but not too tight. And then you're going to let your finger off the safety and you're going to continually pull back until that bow gives you that surprise release. Now make sure you always have your hand completely rigid and firm on the release. You want the release set right down this row of knuckles so that your hand can be flat and your anchor position secure. You don't want to relax the fingers or let the release be out on the tip of the fingers because you're going to run the risk of letting go of the release. Now, if you know you struggle with target anticipation or target panic and you're in the habit of flinching or punching the trigger with some of your older style release aids, then definitely be mindful of securely holding on this release. And when you let off the safety, just tell yourself, pull, 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 pull until it fires. Don't think about having to let the arrow go, because most of the time when you start thinking that way, your brain ends up doing exactly what you're telling it to, and some people end up inadvertently letting go of the release. So make sure you keep the hand rigid, and especially with a tension activated release, as you pull, the more firm your hand, the more consistent that pressure will be as you pull, and the more consistent the release will fire as you come through your shot. Because with this being a tension release, if you're pulling hard against the wall but also letting tension off with the fingers, you never really build enough pressure for that to fire before the release is either at the tip of the fingers or before you've completely exerted the amount of expansion that you have in the pull. So learning to rack that release down that center row of the knuckles like that, keeping your hand firm and rigid and fingers wrapped around the release. And the last thing I like to think about is actually pulling with about 60% of the pressure on my index finger and that other 40% on my middle finger. If you start to pull more with the middle finger and rock the release or change the position of the loop on the hook itself, you actually change the leverage at which the loop is pulling on the trigger. And when it comes to a tension activated release, leverage is everything. So consistency really comes from consistency in hand position, hand angle, and proper pull through. The next thing is, if by chance you're shooting a very heavy bow, or if you're, say, a mini back or a mini silverback shooter and you're shooting lower poundage, then what you may need to do is utilize the different springs that are in the spring kit. So there's one spring in the release and there's 3 extra springs. In this example, I'm going to pretend that this release is actually for my wife. So I'm going to set this to where it has a very light spring in it because she doesn't have much holding weight at all. So in order to change out these springs, all you need to do is, depending on the release, is you're going to want to make sure that your clasp is closed, and you're going to insert an Allen key into the middle screw that is closest to the trap door, the spring door. Okay, this screw is silver on a mini silverback. It's the small black screw on the original silverback. Okay, so we're going to insert that into that hole. We're going to loosen this up and remove this screw completely. Then what you need to recognize is, as you remove this small trap door which contains a spring, You're going to want to make sure that you understand that there is a spring in there, so be careful that you don't let it project out without catching it. So one of the ways to remove this door easily is to insert your Allen key into the back of the release, tighten this door all the way down, or tighten this screw all the way down onto the door. Then go ahead and start backing that screw out, which you can see starts to easily back out the trap door, which is holding the spring. Then it's wise to actually keep pressure towards the safety. And essentially what you're doing is trying to keep some pressure on that spring so that as you slide it out, it doesn't launch across the room. So I've gone ahead and pulled this out. Once you've backed it out far enough, you can hold it with your fingers and slowly remove it, and also use your index finger on the top just to guard that spring from coming out of the release. So right here is the spring that's sitting within the small device for adjustment. So I'm going to remove this completely, and you can see this is the internal component of the silverback. So from there, all you have to do is remove the spring that is either too stiff or too light for you, put the new spring in, and just reinsert it in the reverse order. Now remember, each spring has a margin of poundage from a lighter side to a heavier side. The 43-pound spring comes standard in the release itself. You also get a 30-pound spring, a 50-pound spring, and a 59-pound spring. When you adjust the back of the release, every 2 turns is equal to about 1 pound of tension pressure. The 30-pound spring has a range of 11 to 22 pounds, whereas the 50-pound spring has a range from 15 to 31 pounds, and the stiffest 59-pound spring has a range of 20 to 39 pounds. The standard spring that comes in both the silverback and mini silverback has a tension of 14 to 28 pounds as the range. So you do have the ability to adjust your spring all the way in or all the way out based on what comes standard. And if by chance those numbers are not either light enough or stiff enough for you, you do have the ability to change out the other springs. So from there, what you want to do is take the 2 parts that you just had, hold the silverback in your hand. I find it easier to push the safety lever down and go ahead and reinsert the spring back into the casing, and make sure that the spring doesn't fall backwards. The spring needs to be vertical. And once you slide it back in to that position, you can re-tighten the case screw, and from there you have full adjustment of this screw of the high and low range. So that's how you set your silverback with the scale, as well as adjust the springs. From there, if you try doing this without a scale with your bow, what you want to do is start out close to a target, and you're going to make sure that as you draw your bow, your finger is on the safety. You're going to draw back with your finger on the safety, get to your wall, let off the safety very slow, and if it fires just like that, then you know the release is set up too light. So you're going to go ahead and close that release. You're going to add tension by tightening it in. This is a very light spring, which is why I got to move it a long way. And repeat your process. Put your finger on the safety, draw back. You're anchored, you're looking at your target, You're letting off your release. If it still fires, you know it's too light. That's the lightest spring. Once you have it correct, you're going to be able to draw back, let off the safety, continue to pull until you get that release to fire.